Quick lessons from books. The Captured Economy by Brink, Lindsey, and Teles. You're probably under the impression that licensing and regulation and requirements to get into a specific profession leads to higher quality of service for consumers. That's not really the case. Now, this is not a video, or their book is not based on saying that all licensing's bad and all regulation's bad and we should get rid of it. It's more the idea of maybe we should dial it back a little bit because the licensing and regulation that we have doesn't really serve the consumers. It actually hurts the consumers and helps a small portion of the population. So again, it's not about getting rid of all licensing. It's that maybe we're going a little bit too far. And so the first idea we want to talk about is this idea that licensing is connected or related to quality, which is not really the case. Now, you can hang on to that belief for a second, but one thing we can agree on, well, we'll get to what we can agree on, but their main point here is that licensing and regulation leads to the slowing of economic growth. That is one of the biggest points. They don't say we need to completely get rid of it, and they don't say it's completely killing the economy, but over-regulating, over-licensing in specific places in specific ways is slowing economic growth. Let's use an example here. You want to be a teacher, and there are steps to the process. You got to graduate high school, you got to graduate college, you've got to pass testing requirements, there are background checks. There's a lot of hurdles in the way. There's licensing and regulations that prevent you from getting into that job. Basically, there's a barrier to entry. What they argue is that the barrier to entry to being a doctor, to being a lawyer, being a teacher, being a cosmetologist, often these barriers are too high. They are too strict, and they are slowing economic growth. Again, they're not saying get rid of all licensing in particular. They're saying that maybe we need to lower the bar. We need to get rid of a lot of these barriers to entries into fields, because if we lower the standards, and I know that's going to sound like a bad thing, but if we lower some of these licensing requirements, you're going to increase the amount of applicants into a pool that can take that job. And by allowing more people to have the opportunity to teach, schools are going to have a bigger pool to draw from. Hospitals are going to have a bigger pool to draw from. And in theory, selecting from more candidates will lead to better candidates, which should lead to actually higher quality service, as opposed to raising the requirements that only a select few get through. Now, the theory there is that if you have a high barrier of entry, only the best will get through. Sure, that can happen, but that's not necessarily what the research shows. We'll go more into that. One thing that we can all agree on is that when we do have licensing requirements and graduation requirements, we are preventing people from getting into specific fields. We are creating a barrier of entry. And when you create a barrier of entry, you're going to limit or lower the supply of doctors, lower the supply of teachers, lawyers, you name the profession, you're going to lower the supply. And when we lower the supply, we are going to increase the price when we have strict regulation. Again, we don't want to get rid of all licensing and regulation. They're saying maybe we should dial it back. But when you don't dial it back and you have strict licensing and regulation, you are going to create higher pricing. So you can continue to argue with me about, no, licensing does create higher quality. Let's just put that to the side. We can agree that through licensing and restricting access to specific fields, you are limiting the supply of doctors, lawyers, whatever you want to name. And when the supply of those professions are lower, the price for those services is going to be higher. And so for you as a consumer, quality to the side here, we know as a consumer, you're going to have to pay higher pricing because licensing has limited supply. You're going to get less choice because licensing has lessened supply. It's not necessarily a good thing. So even if you still are under the impression that you're getting better quality, you definitely are not getting a better price and you're not getting as many choices. Let's go another step further, because I know the first thing that you want to talk about is the medical field. And you're saying, well, you know what? I kind of hear you, but ultimately I want my doctor to graduate from the best medical schools, graduate from the best undergraduate degrees, pass their MCATs. Is that what it is? Whatever licensing, the best residency. We want these requirements on the healthcare field because we want to make sure that our nurses and doctors are providing high quality. And you're right. Obviously, if a doctor goes to Johns Hopkins or goes to Harvard, they're going to be very intelligent and they're going to be the best in their field and they're going to provide high quality service. Not disagreeing. Licensing in that sense is going to provide high quality service. But the question is to who? Who will receive that service? We know that by creating these licensing and regulations, we lower supply and that drives up price. So yes, there's high quality, but with that high quality of service, because of licensing, comes a high price for service. And guess what? Not everyone can afford that price. So this is great for the high income, for the rich of our country, because It's high quality. It's a high price that they can afford. This prices many poor, middle income, low income people just completely out. They don't receive services whatsoever. So yes, licensing did create high quality for those that can afford it. The rest of the people are having to use homeopathic medicine. They're going to have to visit quacks. They're not going to get good services. So overall, the healthcare field in general, when you calculate the homeopathic, when you calculate going to quacks, when you calculate just not going to the doctor at all, the overall health of the nation actually decreases. The quality goes down. So quality might go up for a select few. And that's one of the big arguments of this book is that, yes, licensing and these specific regulations can help a select few. But for the overall population, high regulation of specific fields, high licensing doesn't really help the overall population. Again, fighting the argument here that licensing is connected to quality. We all believe that as a teacher, as doctors, as lawyers, that these licensing requirements were created with quality in mind. But that doesn't seem to be the case when we look at the facts. If we look at Utah, we look at Florida, we would assume that licensing requirements for any profession should be similar, because it's not that the licensing needs to connect with Utah or the licensing necessarily needs to connect with Florida. The licensing needs to connect with the quality of the profession. Specific requirements are necessary to become a teacher. It doesn't matter. You need to know specific things. You need to pass certain tests. Same thing with a lawyer. The requirements to teach someone in Utah shouldn't be that different than to teach someone in Florida. The requirements to operate on someone's brain in Utah shouldn't be much different than to operate someone's brain in Florida, although we often wonder about the brains of people in Florida. But it shouldn't be different. Now, again, there's going to be a little bit of difference, obvious, but there shouldn't be giant disparities in licensing requirements. But that's what we find. Let's look at Brinks and Lindsey will point out manicuring. Being a manicurist in Alabama requires 163 days of training. To become a licensed manicurist in Alabama requires 163 days of training. Is that a lot? I have no idea. I'm not a manicurist. Is that too much? Is that too few? I don't know what to tell you. But I can tell you that in Iowa, it only requires 9 days. That doesn't make sense. If licensing is connected to the quality of the profession, then why do you need 163 hours of training in Alabama as opposed to Iowa? Do the people in Alabama have just mangled hands? Are we operating on bear claws? I mean, I know in the picture this lady's got a pretty crooked finger, and I don't know if that's going to do much for you, honey, if you've got your fingernails looking in perfect shape. Your hands are pretty gnarly. But I would assume that manicuring in each state should be the same, and so the licensing requirements should be the same if licensing is connected to quality. But it doesn't seem that licensure is created based on quality. It looks like licensure requirements based on education and testing. Someone else is coming up with these numbers. Someone else is creating these for other reasons than quality. And definitely not providing better services for the people. Customer service, quality service is not really what's coming in mind. When they're thinking like, oh, how do we provide better service for the people? I don't know, 9 days. Alaska requires 3 days. 3 days is what they decided. Let's go to another field, cosmetology. To be a cosmetologist licensed on average in the United States of America, 372 days of training. That's basically 2 entire school years to do people's hair, to do some blowouts. Again, I don't know if that's a lot. I don't know, holiday hair, don't care, but I'm not getting highlights. I don't know much about it. I'm just going to assume that seems pretty normal, 2 years to work on people's wigs. Fine, fair enough. We look at EMTs, emergency services, people that are dealing with emergency crises, saving people's lives, or sometimes people die, but it's a big deal. They're dealing with serious drugs, serious medical preventions, serious situations. Yeah, that's a pretty tough job, but it only requires 33 days of training. How is that possible? If it takes 372 days to do someone's hair, but 33 days to save someone's life. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't add to the argument that licensing is connected to quality of service. How can that be the case if it only takes 33 days to become an ambulance driving, life-saving human being as opposed to chit-chatting and spinning somebody's hair around? It doesn't seem that licensing and regulations are created with quality service in mind. We look at dentists. There was a research study that compared dentists in states where there was strict licensing regulation, where they had to pass tougher tests, compared to states where they were more lenient. The regulations were not as strict, the testing was not as tough. So they compare the two states. And in theory, you would think, well, in the states where the regulations and the licensing are really tough, only the best dentists will pass those tests. And so being that they're the best dentists, they will provide the best service. But that's not what we find out. We find out that the states where the testing was not that difficult, they provided the same amount of service. So it didn't matter. We look at teachers and we look at teacher testing. And so we look at states where the testing requirements are very difficult compared to the states where it's easier to pass the state required licensing tests. And in theory, you would think in the states where the testing requirements are harder, you would only get the best teachers and you get better quality service, but that's not the case. We find out that higher testing requirements for teachers does not provide better service. The education was exactly the same. Florida. Continuing the idea of licensing equality. Florida, after Hurricane Katrina, they've got all these roofs busted up. They've got a bunch of houses. They need to fix the houses. So one of the things that Florida decides is to pull back on the restrictions on roofers. They become more lenient. Now, that's good because if we have less restrictions, then you're going to have more roofers. You're going to be able to fix the roofs. It's roofuses, and it'll be at a better price. Now, the problem is when you lower the standard, the fear is that if we lower the standard of becoming a roofer, you're going to get bad roofers and you're going to get bad quality. But that's not what happened. They lowered the standard of roofers and the quality did not diminish. It did not drop whatsoever. The quality was the same. So that leads us to believe that, look, we don't need to get rid of all regulation and licensing, but maybe the problem is that our licensing and regulation is too high. Yeah, no one wants to lower the bar. We have this idea, we're lowering our standards. That's one way to look at it. But lowering your standards when your standards or expectations are too high, are ridiculous, it's not such a bad deal. And maybe that's what we've done. Maybe we've created these ridiculous high bars and high barriers of entry into specific fields to protect the people that are already in the fields, creating a low supply and raising their wages. Think about it. One of the theories to why the standards are so high is to limit entry into those professions. And if there's less people in those professions, there's a lower supply, they earn higher wages. If we lower, because again, the licensing is not connected to quality. The licensing is often connected to regulations created by politicians and policymakers who were pushed in that direction by people trying to prevent access to the specific fields, limiting entry and keeping wages up. Let's keep on going with this. Uber and Lyft are another perfect example. Now, there was never really any deregulation, but it was de facto deregulation in licensing here, where we went from taxi cab drivers to now Lyft and Uber all competing in the same cities. We have increased supply, great for the consumers, which has lowered prices, which again is great for the consumers to have basically de facto deregulation of licensing. And then ultimately, you have more choice. Good for the consumers. Who's it bad for? Well, it's bad for the taxi drivers because they basically had a monopoly before. But now by deregulation, you create competition and it's better for the consumers. And the taxi cab drivers have been forced to improve the quality of service. Before, they were the only show in town. If you didn't want to ride in their taxi, too bad, too sad. You had to deal with their guff. You had to deal with whatever their rules were. Now you have the choice of going to Uber, going to Lyft. And so they've had to compete in the marketplace. They've created apps to kind of mimic and compete with what Uber and Lyft are doing. They've also, research has been done that shows that taxi cab drivers are getting better reviews. Why is it that cab drivers are getting positive reviews and customer reviews? Because now that they're competing with Uber and Lyft, they have to treat you with some respect. They have to treat you with dignity. They have to be kind. They have to be pleasant. Before, you had to ride with them and you had no other option. So if they were smelly and mean, then you just had to deal with it. Now you have other options, so they have to be kind and respectful to you. All this happens through de facto regulation, or at least lowering licensing requirements. Economic mobility is a big deal in our country. People want to move from being poor to being rich. People want to earn more money, and people want to provide better lives for their children so that their children can earn more money. It's a big part of American life, maybe until recently. Now, connected to economic mobility is also the idea of geographic mobility. Climbing the ladder and making more money and raising your socioeconomic status often requires you to move elsewhere. If you only look for jobs in the area where you live, you're going to have limited options, and it's less likely that you're going to find a better job where you earn more wages. So if you expand your search and you look at other states, then it's more likely that you're going to find a better job where you can earn more money, and you can participate in economic mobility. And we see the research where we look at high school graduates or college graduates versus people that don't graduate from high school. If you don't graduate from high school, you're very likely to not move away from your hometown. Whereas if you're a college graduate, you're more likely to move away. So geographic mobility leads to economic mobility. That leads to economic growth in our nation. The problem is different states have different licensing requirements for you name the occupation. So researchers looked and said, okay, do these licensing requirements in different states, do they prevent geographic mobility? Because if they prevent geographic mobility, then they're going to prevent economic mobility, which will lead to slower growth, if any growth at all. So what they compare is mobility within the state. So they look at intrastate mobility. They look at people moving from, we have Florida here, Tallahassee to Orlando, Orlando to Miami, and you can move freely within the state because the state license applies to all those different cities. And they find that people move within the state much more than they move between states. And the theory, or actually what the research they found out was the reason for the lack of economic or the lack of geographic mobility between states was licensure requirements. So again, the idea of these high burdensome licensure and regulation is preventing geographic mobility, which then prevents economic mobility, which slows growth nationally. Russia, into the Cold War, or the collapse of Russia, the Soviet Union, doctors moved from the Soviet Union to Israel. And they did not become doctors. Well, why is that? Well, the regulations and the licensure requirements in Israel were too high, too strict. So the best doctors did not become doctors, which doesn't make sense. The best should just go ahead and be doctors. But they didn't, because there's, like we see here, I'm a smart man. I have a lot of options. I'm not going to waste my time with these onerous regulations. So the best doctors who have plenty of other things to do say, I'm not going to waste my time with this. I'll go get some other job. And only the doctors who weren't as good, who didn't have very many options, who had no choice but to deal with the ridiculous restrictions and regulations, they became doctors. So we actually saw a lower quality of service when you had high licensing and regulation standards. Not to mention you got lower supply, lower quality, and price went up. 8,604 medical school graduates in 2016. That's 25% of all graduates did not get a residency. So for basically what we're saying is 1/4 of all medical school graduates did not become doctors. That's a bit of a problem in a nation where we are scared out of our minds, furiously upset about healthcare costs and how expensive it is. When 1/4 of your doctors do not become doctors, that's a bit of a problem. Maybe we become less strict with our regulation and less strict with our licensing so that more of those doctors get a residency and they actually become doctors. And we'll increase the supply of doctors, which will lower the prices. What do you think about that, Bernie? Wrong Bernie. That Bernie. Huh? In conclusion, the end result of mandatory licensing is higher prices, worse service, stunted innovation, and large and ill-gotten gains for groups that crowd the upper percentiles of the income scale. Quick lessons from books, Captured Economy.